All right. Couple of announcements. One is on Thursday at 7 p.m. in lane 124 is anarcho-capitalism. Is it viable? Okay. This is from the Classical Liberal Organization. So lane 124 next door, Thursday. Okay. Don't forget, review session is on Tuesday in here. Again, if the computer works, I'll Zoom it for people who can't be in attendance. I also sent you an email about my office hours for this week. Again, Monday and Tuesday I have events that I have to do, but so today I'll be in from 3 to 5, and Tuesday I'll be in from 11 to 2:30. Wednesday, and I sent out an email, but I'm also going to add to my office hours on Thursday, so I'll be there from 9 to 12 and 1 to 3 on Thursday, and regular office hours on Wednesday. All right. Yeah.
What time is the review session?
Review session for this class is 6 to 7:30. Okay. So yeah.
Will that be recorded and posted, or just Zoom live?
It's not going to be recorded. Okay. So if you, well, yes, Zoom records it. So I will send you out a link to the Zoom recording of it. All right. So if you, so you can do it either way. If sometimes the computer doesn't work. So, and so I'm going to go ahead and take roll today. All right, Joe Bentley, Thomas Bricker, Jaden. Is Tyler in? He said he might be sick. Okay. Teresa Enns. She might also be that way. I'll check. Andro Giovanetti. Okay. Drew Godsall. Michael Hagestad. Kaisa. Jillian Jordan. Luke Keller. Rachel. Anthony Lamacchia. There he is. Yep. Caroline Lively. And Vera knows that. Lindsay's here. Women's volleyball, doing really well. Andrew Nell. Emma. Thomas Rogers. Michaela. Sarah Strauss. Samuel. Parker not here today. Joe Wagner. Did he? Okay, he sent me something. Sarah Wagner. Kaylin. Aiden Wheeler. Mercedes. Okay. The band pick of the week this week is Carolina Chocolate Drops. Has anybody heard Carolina Chocolate Drops? They are a Grammy Award winner. They are a traditional string band. They do Celtic music and traditional music. You might want to take a listen to there's a video, YouTube video, Country Girl, that's a good example of their music. So you might want to, like I said, they won a Grammy for Best Traditional Folk Album. So obviously you guys don't do a lot of traditional folk music listening. So, but go ahead and take a listen to them. All right. Let's see what I'm doing here. Okay. Now, last time we finished pretty much chapter 10, and I had noted that that's what we were going to cover for the midterm. And again, we're going to have the review session on Tuesday, but I thought I'd just go over some, just let you know what are going to, the exam questions are going to be there. Okay, so you're not going to be surprised. There's going to be 4 essay questions, and one of the essay questions is going to, again, if you've looked at the old exams, I'm going to ask you to define Pareto optimality. Right? So you're going to have to tell me what Pareto optimality is, and there's 3 necessary conditions, right? So there's conditions in exchange. That was the margin rate of substitution got to be the same for everybody. In production, it has to be that the marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital has got to be the same for everybody. And then the overall efficiency is that the ratio of the marginal costs have to be equal to the marginal rates of substitution, the ratio of the margin utilities, right? So I want you to tell me what these 3 necessary conditions are, and I'm going to want you to why competitive markets satisfy those. Right? So I'm not going to ask you, we actually drew the Edgeworth box diagrams to show you that those conditions held. I'm not going to ask you to do that. I just want you to tell me what are these 3 necessary conditions. I want you to tell me why a competitive market satisfies those. And first of all, again, if you have, for the first condition, you had that consumers maximize utility. So they set their marginal rates of substitution equal to the price ratio. But the second thing is that everybody faces the same price ratio, right? So then they all must be setting their marginal rates of substitution equal to one another. Second thing was, if you were cost minimizing, you'd set your ratio of the marginal products of labor and capital equal to the price of labor and capital. But everybody's facing the same price ratio, so they all must be setting their marginal rate, their marginal ratio of the marginal products equal to one another. And then the third condition is that if you are a profit maximizer, what's going on? You're setting price equal marginal cost. So everybody facing the same price ratio, marginal cost of X to the marginal cost of Y has got to be equal to the price of X to the price of Y. But if consumers and producers are facing the same price ratio, then that third condition is going to hold. All right? So I want you to be able to answer that question. Right? So again, we'll go into a little bit more on the review session, but that's definitely going to be one of the questions. A second question is going to be, I'm going to ask you about positive and negative externalities. So you're going to have to tell me what they are, and that is basically where either the producer is imposing a marginal cost on someone else that's not being picked up in the price system, or who's making the positive externality is providing a marginal benefit to somebody, but it's not being picked up in the price system. Okay? And then I'm going to ask you what can you do to, well, first of all, I want you to be able to draw a demand and supply curve and show me that picture, right? So we had the picture where again, we'll do more of this on the review session, but you had a demand and supply, and if what happened was you had a marginal external cost, the actual marginal external cost was up there, we would be producing here, that would be QE, but Q star would be there, and we said all those units have we'll call that plus the externality. All those units have a marginal cost, including the external costs, which are greater than the marginal benefits. And so that was the welfare loss that was going on because of that. And then I'm going to ask you to tell me how you might resolve that, right? So you should be able to tell me something about a Pigouvian tax. Remember that we said, okay, you set the tax equal to the marginal external cost. That will solve the problem. What's the difficulty with that? Well, how do you actually know what the marginal external cost was? Or I might ask you to tell me about the Coase theorem, where the Coase theorem says, well, in the absence of transactions costs, what will happen is that it doesn't matter to whom you assign the property right, that it will, the parties will bargain and it will go to the person that values it the most, right? So you should be able to maybe give me a little example of that, right? So I'll ask you probably either one of these, either a Pigouvian tax or the Coase theorem. You have to tell me about that. The third one, the third essay question is going to be, again, if you look back to your notes, it's an obvious thing to do, is the public goods. Right, so you're going to tell me what a public good is, right? It's non-rival in consumption, right? That it's they're difficult to exclude, and everybody gets the same amount. And the point is that it doesn't make sense to exclude people because Pareto optimality says if I can make one person better off and not make anyone else worse off, then I ought to move to that point. Well, if it's non-rival in consumption, then it doesn't make sense to exclude you because I can make you better off and no one else worse off. And then I'll ask you to either deal with, to explain what happens with, Lindahl, right? What was the Lindahl was to say that I'm going to charge everybody their marginal benefit at the point where the sum of the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost. You should also, again, be able to tell me about the Samuelson condition, right? That the optimal point is where the sum of the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost. Lindahl says, okay, go to that point where the sum of the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost, charge everybody their marginal benefit at that point. Everybody will be happy at that point, right? They will be unanimous. Nobody want to move from there. Or I might ask you about Wicksel's suggestion. Wicksel's suggestion was that you keep putting forth a tax and expenditure combination and then see if everybody agrees on it. If everybody agrees on it, then you're there. But of course, one of the problems of those is the transactions cost can be really high. And if I know I can block the public good from being provided by voting no, you might bargain with me. Okay, so you should be able to talk a little bit about Wicksel. And then, I might ask you about the Bowen model. Right, and that was that the median voter, if you assume a normal distribution of preferences, the median voter will determine the outcome, and the output that the median voter prefers is where the sum of the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost, because we've assumed that the median and the mean are the same by assuming a normal distribution of preferences. Okay, so you should, again, we'll talk more about it at the review session, but you should be able to handle that. Okay, so that's 3 of the 4 essays. The 4th essay I might pick from a number of things. I might ask you about Buchanan's theory of clubs, right? You've seen some of the old exams I'll ask about Buchanan's theory of clubs. I might ask you about the benefit, when you're distributing taxes, the benefit principle or the ability to pay principle, and what are some of the problems with this. So we had a discussion about might have user charges or tax complementary goods as part of the benefit principle. We might talk about when ability to pay. How do you measure vertical equity? How do you measure horizontal equity? Okay. Another thing I could ask you about is this Adam Smith, this trade-off between efficiency and equity, and what are the considerations that you would have in administrative costs. You know, we talked about, you know, administrative costs and, you know, the cost of compliance and the cost of ensuring that people actually pay the tax, et cetera. Okay? Or I could ask you about these, we closed with these alternatives to taxation, right? And we talked about the different alternatives: debt finance, inflation, user charges, or government-owned enterprises, and what are some of the difficulties with that, right? So that fourth question will, you know, will be picked from among those, right? So when you walk in there, you know, you're only going to have, you know, 55 minutes to do. I'm going to have 5 multiple choice, 5 true, false, and 4 essay questions. So you're going to have already thought out your answers before you walk in there. If you're not going to be starting to think, oh yeah, well, how did Buchanan's theory of clubs work? You know, I sort of have that. It's got something to do with, something to do with, as we add members, the cost per person goes down and the benefit per person goes down, but can't quite remember how that all worked, right? No, you should walk in there, you know, ready to go with it. All right. Okay. Any questions about what the exam's going to look like? All right. So, like I said, there's several of the old exams. And I've told you about this in the exam number 1 subfolder. So, again, come in, fired up, ready to go on that. Also. And I'll remind you on Wednesday, but bring blue books, okay? So you're going to be doing yours in a blue book, so bring a blue book. I will have blue books for sale, but you'll probably have pretty inelastic demand, and so they're going to be expensive, all right? So it'd be much cheaper to go to the bookstore and buy yourself a blue book sometime between now and Friday morning, all right? Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about now is Chapter 11, which is where we're talking about tax efficiency. And remember that we talked about possibly this trade-off between efficiency and equity. So one of the things that we're going to show you right now is that if you take just a tax per person, that's going to be more efficient in a sense in terms of a welfare loss than a tax on people's income or a tax on a particular good. We mentioned briefly that Margaret Thatcher had some problems because she was listening to her economist that told her that this is a efficient way to do a tax. Well, it turns out that's probably going to tax in a way that people aren't satisfied with the ability to pay issue or the equity issue, and so she ended up having some problems with that. But let's just start out. Let's look at what I'm going to show is that a lump sum tax, that is just everybody pays the same amount, is more efficient than a sales tax on a particular good. And oftentimes the way you describe that is it's an excise tax. An excise tax is basically a tax on a particular good. So let's take the gasoline tax as an example. And so if we take a look at an indifference curve analysis, which we started out the class with sort of making sure that everybody knows how to do that. If we have the amount of gas that you can buy, in terms of, this is the quantity of gasoline we're going to have down here. Well, if you spend all your income on gasoline, right, you could buy that much gasoline. And if you spend all your income on everything else, right, so we're, again, assuming there's sort of two goods or group, all the other things you could buy and gasoline. If you spent your income on all the other stuff, right? That would be that would be there, right? So this is expenditures on all other goods. And we have a constant price. So you have a fixed price for gasoline. And so what happens to your budget line looks like that. So what did we assume? We assume that you guys maximize utility, right? So you maximize your utility there. And you buy, let's say, G1 units of, call that I for all of the goods. You buy G1 units of the gasoline, and you buy I1 units of all of the goods. So now what we're going to do is we're going to impose a tax, and suppose we tax gasoline. We have a per unit tax on gasoline. Right? So suppose we have a 20-cent per gallon tax on gasoline. Well, if we were to, do our Rod Stewart thing and draw the picture that tells that story, right? So let's say it's 20 cents per gallon. If you don't buy any gasoline, you still buy the same. You can still get the same amount of everything else, right? But you can't buy as much. Right? I can't buy as much gasoline if I put a tax on it. So how did we show a change in the price of a particular good when we were doing an indifference curve analysis? We said, okay, if I increase the price of a good, we're going to move to there. So now what's going to happen? Now what's going to happen is they're going to go to an indifference curve. Call that, which one? U0? No, I'll do that U2. Okay. So U2, and so now what's going to happen, you're going to have, that's the amount of gas you're going to buy, and now that's the amount of, if you spend all your money, that's the amount of other stuff that you could have, all right? So this is your new budget line, so when you're at U2, what are you going to get? G2 and I2 instead of G1 and I1. Now, I got two things going on there, right? I got a substitution effect and an income effect. Right? Sort of think back to the idea that you had a substitution income effect. What if I eliminated the substitution effect and if I just took that income away from you? I took the same amount of income away from you that you paid in the gas tax. So how much income did you pay in the gas tax? What did you pay in the gas tax? Well, if you bought that, if you had your old income level back here, right? If you bought G2, you could buy up here, you could buy that amount, right? You could buy some sort of I star. So what is the amount of tax? If we take it I star minus I2, that must be the amount that you paid off in taxes, right? Because now you're buying G2, you can only buy I2. If you had your income back and you bought G2, then you could buy I star. Okay? What if what we did is we just took that same amount of income away from you, but we didn't change the price ratio? I just took the income away. Right? So we're going to be at G2, I2. Suppose that we did was that, so at this point we know what the tax is. Just said here, the tax is I star minus I2. So what if you just taxed I star minus I2? So I'm keeping the same price ratio now, and I'm going to draw a new budget line, which is parallel to the old budget line because I've got the same price ratio. If I do that, if I were to then take this amount, what's going to happen? I'm going to draw a new budget line which goes through that point, right? But it's now flatter. right? So because now I've taken this, if I take the this budget line and now I just move this budget line the same, okay? So I make it go through, what's going to happen? This slope should be equal to that slope. Should have drawn that with more curve on it so I don't have to do that part. But notice what's going to happen is that because your indifference curve is convex, it must cross it at 2 points, right? It's going through the same line, but the slope is flatter. Okay? So it goes through I2G2, right? But it has flatter slope, right? Because I didn't change the price ratio, right? So it has the old price ratio. What does that mean? It must cross it at 2 points. What does that mean? It means there must be an indifference curve which is higher up than U2. If we sort of do the detail of this thing, what's going to happen is I'm going to, if we just look at the detail, I've got this indifference curve and I've got a budget line going through here, right? And now I've got a budget line going through there because it's got the same slope, but it's going through the same point, but it's a flatter slope. It must cross it here and here, so there must be some indifference curve. If this is U2, there must be some U3, which is a higher indifference curve. So what does that tell you? It tells you that if I took this, if I imposed the same amount of tax on you as I would under the gasoline tax, and I just took that money away from you, I just reduced your income, what happens is that now I don't have the substitution effect, so I can always move to a higher indifference curve by having the lump sum tax. Okay? So I must be at a higher indifference curve from a lump sum tax. So what does that tell you? It tells you that I can make you better off by imposing a lump sum tax than by imposing a gasoline tax that takes the same amount of money from you. Therefore, a lump sum tax is going to have a higher utility for everybody than is a excise tax, and so is going to be more efficient. Right? So we have a lump sum tax is more efficient, right? Because I can move you to a higher indifference curve. So summarizing what happens, I start out with some budget line and an indifference curve. Then what I do is I impose a tax on one of the goods. I impose a tax on the gasoline tax. That gives me a new indifference curve. If what I did was I made that difference the same, okay, and I just dropped this line down, the original budget line, down by the same amount, so I took the same amount of income away, it's going to cross this old indifference curve at 2 points because it's now flatter. Since this thing's convex, it must have crossed it at 2 points, which means there must be some indifference curve which is up there, says you can be at a higher indifference curve. Now, a couple obvious issues with that is, again, we have the point that we can, we can tell you this is a way to go, right? This is the optimal way to do it, but how do you actually implement it, right? We know that a Pigouvian tax will get you to the optimal amount, right? But how do I really know what the marginal external costs you are imposing on somebody else, okay? So how do you actually implement it? Well, that tells you, again, you might want to have a carbon tax might be a mechanism to deal with global warming or something like that, if that's a negative externality. Similarly here, a lump sum tax is going to be more efficient than an excise tax. But, you know, first of all, how to know how much you're going to pay in the gasoline tax, right? I'd have to go around and let's say you buy, you have a car that gets really high gas mileage, so you don't pay much gasoline tax, okay? So the lump sum tax that I impose on you, right, should be the amount of the, I'm showing the amount of the tax here, right? How do I know that what is the lump sum tax ought to be taken from you guys, right? So how do you actually implement that? Again, we've shown that if I took the same amount of tax away from you under a different what mechanism, that is under a lump sum tax, then I'm going to allow you to reach a higher indifference curve. But how do I actually implement that sort of thing? And so again, we need to sort of think about what is happening here. The inefficiency is coming from the substitution effect. That's an important point to make, because if what we're doing is we're trying to raise, let's say, $50 million, well, let's say we're trying to raise $1.9 trillion, right, to make it so that we balance out the, the President Biden's coronavirus relief package. Let's say we weren't going to use deficit financing to do it. We were going to actually tax people to do that. We have to raise the $1.9 trillion. What type of tax should we use in order to get the $1.9 trillion? Okay, that means the income effect is going to be the same. I'm going to raise the I got to raise $1.9 trillion. Okay, whether I do it through an income tax or a sales tax or corporate income tax or however I'm going to do it. So what I really ought to be looking at is just the substitution effect. All right, because the income effect is going to be the same. So what I'm really what we really ought to be doing is just looking at the inefficiency is coming from the fact that you've changed that price ratio, and therefore, if you sort of remember back when we looked at if we had a good y and x, right, and we started out at U0, and what happened was we changed the price of x. What happened? We ended up there at U1, but remember, to get the substitution effect, what did we do? We took that line and we put it back on the original indifference curve, okay? And that gave you the substitution effect. And if we put this line up here, let's say we went to there, so we started out at x0 and we end up at x1. Well, we had xs being there. So what happened was from x0 to xs was the substitution effect, and what was the income effect? It was the change from the substitution effect to wherever you ended up. That was the income effect. And if it was a normal good, they move in the same direction. If it's an inferior good, they move in opposite directions. So basically, what we're trying to do here is show that the substitution effect is the problem in terms of efficiency. Again, do we really do lump sum taxes where we just say, okay, here's how much you owe and here's how much you owe, okay, and taxes just boom, that's it, do whatever you want? Do we do the same for everybody? We make it so that everybody has to pay, like we have a head tax, everybody has to pay $1,500. Though you don't see that taxation other than there was again, if you look on page 393 in the textbook, there's a big discussion about when Thatcher proposal to have a more efficient way of levying the tax. What it turns out that those things tend to be unpopular because they tend to be not related to as much to ability to pay, and people are, make that trade-off. So we don't really see that, but it is informative to know that what I do is if I could actually do a lump sum tax, which is the amount that you would have paid otherwise, you could be happier from just taking that same amount of tax from you than if I imposed a sales tax on something. All right, guys got that? Okay, all right. So so let's take another way of looking at the efficiency of taxation, and we're going to use demand and supply curves to look at that. Okay, so let's say again we're going to look at efficiency. And you can sort of think about efficiency as I've got this pool of water, and I'm going to take a bucket, and I'm going to take a certain amount of water out. Let's say I got a gallon bucket, and I got to get a gallon of water out. Okay, so that's the amount of taxes that I'm going to take out. So I got lots of different ways that I could take out that same gallon of water. One way is I could just slap it in there and splash everything around, right? And water's going all over the place. Or I could take it out, really carefully so I don't move stuff around too much. That's essentially what we're trying to do with efficiency and taxation. We're saying, okay, you got to take out so many millions of dollars or so many trillions of dollars. And what's the way of doing it that doesn't change people's behavior very much? Okay? So the way that we could take it out that doesn't change their behavior very much is going to be a way that we're looking at efficiency. So let's take a look at a demand and supply curve now. And we have the demand curve, and remember again, the demand curve is the sum of everybody's marginal benefit curve. So the demand curve is for the market as a whole, what's that equal to the marginal social benefit, okay? And we had the supply curve, and what is that? That's the sum of all the individual suppliers, and each of them, they're producing at the amount where the marginal benefit to them, which is the price they're getting, is equal to their marginal cost. So this market supply curve is equal to the marginal social cost. And what do we want to do, right? If you just go back to ECON 202 or 105 or whatever, you do things as long as the added benefit's bigger than the added cost. What do I end up with? At equilibrium, right, we end up with PE and QE. We end up at equilibrium where the marginal social cost is just equal to the marginal social benefit. Producing more, right? The marginal social cost is bigger than the marginal social benefit. You wouldn't want to do that. Producing less, these units all have a marginal social benefit bigger than the marginal social cost, and so you wouldn't want to do that. And so what did markets do? Markets, the equilibrium result ends up right there. Now, suppose that what we do is we impose a tax. Again, we can do it on gasoline. If you look at in the state of Michigan right now, the state of Michigan has a per unit tax on gasoline of 26.3 cents. Okay? So when you buy, your gasoline, notice that when you fill up your gas tank, it doesn't tell you how much is the price of the gasoline and how much is the taxes, right? You get the total amount. But in fact, in the state of Michigan, you pay 26.3 cents per gallon in gasoline tax for the state of Michigan. It's actually called the motor carrier fuel tax. And then there's a 18.4 cents per gallon, which is the federal tax. And then in Michigan, there's also a 6% sales tax on the gasoline, and the 6% sales tax includes it's also on not just the price that you paid to Marathon or whatever, it also includes the 18.4 cents that you're paying to the federal government. So in any event, there's a lot of taxes that are showing up when you're buying your gasoline, and it doesn't break it out, right? You're just paying it. You don't know whether it's 30 cents a gallon or 50 cents a gallon or whatever. How many knew what the Michigan gasoline tax was? Right? See, you're all rationally ignorant, right? So that means I could, Governor Whitmer, if you remember, she was going to fix the damn roads, and she was going to increase the Michigan gasoline tax to 45 cents, and there was some discussion about that. So there's something in the paper, but generally there's not a big big to-do about this because, again, people are rationally ignorant about what the taxes are. But in any event, suppose that suppose that we suppose a 20-cent per gallon excise tax, right? So we're going to charge 20 cents a gallon for gasoline. So what's that going to do? And we're going to impose it on the retailer. Okay, we're going to impose it on the seller. Now, we're later on going to show that it doesn't matter whether you impose it on the seller or you impose it on the buyer. The incidence of the tax is the same no matter which way you do it. Okay? But for our picture here, we're going to pick that we're going to impose it on the seller. And it's sort of interesting. I don't know if you, when you look at your Social Security tax, if you ever look at that, it looks like you're paying half and the employer's paying half. Doesn't matter, okay? But since most people haven't taken public finance, they don't know. They think it's more fair that your employer's paying half and you're paying half. Well, it turns out to be exactly the same if you pay all of it or the employer pays all of it in terms of the incidence of the tax. But nonetheless, that's an aside. So let's just impose it on the seller. Well, if what happens then, if it's 20 cents, you're now the seller, what's your marginal cost? Your marginal cost just went up by 20 cents. Okay? So the marginal cost went up by 20 cents per unit. So again, if we take Rod Stewart and every picture tells a story, and what we do is we draw the picture of that, what's going to happen? This marginal cost is now going to be higher by 20 cents everywhere. So this is going to go up, right? So this is going to be S plus the tax, right? And that means it's going to be higher by 20 cents everywhere. So when you go to produce, what are you going to do? You're going to go to, from QE and PE, you're going to go to QT, and now what's going to happen? We're going to call that PG, and we're going to call this PN. And why are we calling it PG and PN? Is because this is we're going to call this the gross price. That is the price that the Marathon Oil is the retailer, that's the price they're getting. But then what's the net price they get? They got to send the 20 cents off to the government, okay? So you're going to pay here, but the Marathon's only going to be able to keep the PN. The retailer's going to keep PN. So we're calling that the net price, and this is the gross price. Well, notice that we're going to have an externality here, right? So if we make that A, B, C, what's the problem? The problem is that all these units from QT to QE have a true marginal benefit, which is bigger than the marginal cost of producing the thing. Right? So the actual marginal cost of producing gasoline is along this supply curve. And so but if you are the seller of gasoline, you're not going to stay back here because now you got to pay the 20 cents off. So your marginal cost is really up here. And so I'm going to have all the units from QT to QE. What's the problem? The problem is that the marginal social benefit is bigger than the marginal social cost. So I'm going to have a welfare loss triangle. And that is going to be here, right? So that the triangle ABC is a welfare loss. Well, that tells you that if what I do is I impose a tax on gasoline, I'm not going to get the optimal amount of gasoline being produced, right? I'm going to be producing less gasoline than I otherwise would have. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a minimal amount of welfare loss when I impose a tax. Now, how much tax are we raising? We're raising that rectangle, right? This is the amount of the tax, right? The difference between the supply curve without the tax and the supply curve with the tax. That times 0 to QT. So the tax is that rectangle PG A B P N, right? So and all that simply is the amount of the tax times the amount of gasoline that you got sold. Well, now what I want to think about is how does that welfare loss, what's the components of that welfare loss? One of the components is coming about because of the income effect, and the other part's coming about because of the substitution effect. But if we're going to compare taxes that are saying I got to get $1.9 trillion in revenue in order to pay for the government goods, then I really just want to look at the substitution effect, because the income effect is going to be the same no matter how I do the tax, right? I could do it through an income tax or a gasoline tax or whatever. So what I want to do is I want to emphasize the substitution effect. And we will call that the excess burden of the tax. The excess burden, we're going to only look at the substitution effect. So what we'll do for Wednesday is we will be working through chapter 11 here. One of the things that we're going to look at is that it turns out, if you remember back, if you set the Wayback Machine, how many of you have now watched the Wayback Machine? Anybody get in there? Got to get on there. You got to get on YouTube. Watch, look at Wayback Machine. Okay, Rocking Bullwinkles. Okay, but the point is that if you know how to measure the area of a triangle, right? It's 1/2 the base times the height. Well, it turns out then we can get a welfare loss that is that we're going to measure the excess burden by looking at the amount of this is the amount of the tax, right? And this is the change in quantity. So if I do 1/2 this times that, I'm going to get the area of that triangle. And we'll discuss next time about how to do that. So go ahead and take a look at that. The actual, we're not going to go into the detail of the algebra to get to that answer, which is in the appendix to chapter 11. So you can go and look through that if you want. But anyway, so we'll be there. Again, don't forget the review session is tomorrow at 6.